Yeah. All right. Let's just watch video.
Hey there guys, Paul here from theengineeringmindset.com. In this video, we are going to be looking at how electricity works. Now this is pretty essential knowledge for any engineer, so we'll run through the basic parts of what you need to know. So let's start at the very basics, and for that we need to take a look at the atom. Everything, including you, is made from atoms. All the materials we use are made from atoms. The materials are just different because the construction of their atoms are slightly different. The atoms are made from three particles, two of which are found inside the nucleus, and the third particle sits outside this. At the center of the atom we have the nucleus. Inside the nucleus we have the neutrons, which have no charge, and we also have the protons, which are positively charged. The neutrons and the protons are much heavier than the electrons, so these will stay within the nucleus. Surrounding the nucleus are different layers of orbital shells. These are like flight paths for the electrons. The electrons flow along these flight paths much like a satellite orbits our planet, except that the electrons travel at almost the speed of light. The electrons are negatively charged and they are attracted to the positive charge of the protons. The electrons orbit around the nucleus in these orbital shells, and there are a set number of how many electrons can be in any one orbital shell. The number of protons, neutrons and electrons an atom has tells us which material it is. Atoms hold on to their electrons very tightly, but some materials will hold on to them more tightly than others. The outermost shell is known as the valence shell, and in this shell some materials have loosely bound electrons which can flow to other atoms. Atoms which can pass electrons are called conductors, and most metals are conductors. On the other hand, atoms which do not have free electrons and so they can't pass electrons between other atoms are known as insulators, and these are things like glass and rubber. Now we can combine these materials to safely use electricity by having the conductor in the center, which allows electrons to move, but surround this with an insulator to restrict where they can flow to, i.e. not into us, which keeps us safe. If we look inside a slice of copper cable at the free electrons surrounding the nucleus of the copper atom, you'll see that the free electrons are able to move to other atoms, but this happens randomly in any direction. If we then connect the slice of copper cable to a closed circuit with a power source, such as a battery, then the voltage will force the electrons to move, and these will then all flow in the same direction to try and get back to the other terminal of the battery. When I say circuit, this just means the route which electrons can flow along between the two terminals, the positive and the negative, of a power source. So we can add things into their path like light bulbs, and this means that the electrons will have to pass through this in order to get to the other terminal, and so we can use this to create things such as light. The circuit can even be open or closed. In a closed circuit, that means the electrons can flow around, and in an open circuit, this means that the electrons are not able to flow. Voltage is a pushing force of electrons within a circuit. It's like pressure in a water pipe. The more pressure you have, the more water can flow. The more voltage you have, the more electrons can flow. But what does a volt mean? Well, a volt is a joule per coulomb, and a joule is a measurement of energy or work, and a coulomb is a group of flowing electrons. We'll have a look at what a coulomb is in just a second though. So a 9-volt battery can provide 9 joules of energy in the form of work or heat per group of electrons that flow from one side of the battery to the other. In this case, the current of electrons flow from one side of the battery through the LED light bulb, which produces light, and then the electrons flow to the other side of the battery. Therefore, 9 joules of light and heat is produced by the light bulb. Current is the flow of electrons. When a circuit is closed, it means electrons can flow, and when the circuit is open, no electrons will flow. We can measure the flow of electrons just like you can measure the flow of water through a pipe. To measure the flow of electrons, we use the unit of amp. 1 amp means 1 coulomb per second, and 1 coulomb is a group of electrons. The group is incredibly large and is approximately 6,242,000,000,000,000,000 billion electrons, and that has to pass in 1 second for it to equal 1 amp. That's why electrons are grouped together and just called amps to make it easier for engineers. Resistance is a restriction to the flow of electrons in a circuit. The wire which carries the electrons will naturally have some resistance. The longer the wire, the greater the resistance. The thicker the wire, the lower the resistance. Resistance to the flow of electrons is different for each material, and the temperature of the material can also change the resistance to the flow of electrons. Electrical circuits use specially designed components known as resistors to purposely restrict the flow of electrons. This is either to protect other components from too many electrons flowing through it, or it can also be used to create light and heat, such as in an incandescent light bulb. Resistance occurs when electrons collide with atoms. The amount of collisions is different from one material to another. Copper has a very low collision rate, but other materials such as iron will have much more collisions. When collisions occur, the atoms generate heat, and at a certain temperature the material will then start to produce light as well as heat, which is how the incandescent lamps work. When a wire is wrapped in a coil, it will generate a magnetic field as the current passes through it. The cable will naturally create an electromagnetic field by itself, it's just intensified by the coil. By wrapping it in a coil, the magnetic field becomes so strong that the magnetic field starts to actually affect the electrons within the wire. But we'll look at why this occurs in a future, more advanced video. We can increase the strength of the magnetic field simply by wrapping the coils around an iron core. We can also increase the number of turns within the coils, and also we can increase the amount of current passing through the circuit. Now this is how electromagnets work, and it's also the basis of how induction motors work. If you want to learn more about induction motors, we've already covered this in another video already, just see the link on screen now. Now when a magnetic field passes across a coil of wire, it will induce a voltage in that wire caused by an induced electromotive force which is pushing the electrons in a certain direction. If the wire is connected in a circuit, then this electromotive force will cause a current to flow. This is the basis of how AC generators work, and the electricity at your wall sockets within your home is produced in a very similar way. Transformer. Now we can combine all of the aspects together that we've just covered, and when we do so we'll see that we can use one coil to generate electricity, and then we can place two other coils in very close proximity to each other but not touching, and this will create a transformer. The transformer will induce a voltage from the first or the primary coil over into the secondary coil, and this will force electrons to flow if the coil in the secondary side has a closed circuit. Now what's important about the transformer is that we can increase or decrease the voltage between the primary and the secondary coils simply by changing the amount of coils on either side. Again, this is a subject all by itself, so we'll cover this in a more advanced video later on. Now something else which I just want to briefly mention is the capacitor. So a capacitor forces positive and negative charges to separate across two plates when it is connected to a power supply. This causes a build-up or store of electrons within an electric field. When the power supply is cut or interrupted, these charges will then be released, flow up and meet again. This provides a power source but only for a few seconds until the charges have paired back up again. It's slightly similar to a battery, but capacitors are very common and they're in almost every single circuit board. We'll cover this obviously in more detail in a future video, just be aware of these. So the last part I want to cover in this video is that there are two types of current electricity, that being alternating current or AC and then direct current or DC. Alternating current simply means that the current flows backwards and forwards in a circuit as the terminals are constantly reversed. This is a bit like the tide of the sea. It goes in and out, in and out, in and out, so that it's reversing constantly. Now alternating current is the most common source of power, and the plug sockets in your homes and your buildings and schools and workplace, etc. These will all be providing alternating current, AC. Now on the other hand, we've got direct current or DC, and that simply means that the current flows directly in only one direction. It does not alternate. This is what's provided from batteries, and almost all your handheld devices are from this as well. So we can convert AC to DC and vice versa using power electronics. And this is how we charge and power small devices. And it's also how solar panels can be used to power our homes, because solar panels produce DC power and our homes need AC power. So we have to convert this for it to be usable. So both AC and DC have pros and cons to it, but for sure we'll look at this in another later video. It's a bit more advanced. And there's also quite an interesting history behind why we use AC and DC and the inventors behind that. If you've got 10 minutes, I definitely recommend having a Google or a YouTube of this too. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and it helped you. If you have any questions, please leave me in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to subscribe and check out our website, theengineeringmindset.com.
So any questions about that? There's a lot of material, but we'll be using these terms, so it's good to know, be introduced to them. And a lot of this is going to be repetition for a lot of you, but for some of you it might be new. So don't hesitate to ask questions. Let's watch another video.
This video is sponsored by HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. My wife and I absolutely love these kits. I don't know exactly what it is, but something about not having to plan the meals or do the shopping completely changes the activity of cooking dinner into this really fun thing that I look forward to all day. HelloFresh comes right to your doorstep with fresh, pre-measured ingredients and easy-to-follow recipe cards.
Did you read it?
We usually get the vegetarian meals, but they have recipes tailored to all kinds of taste.
Crinkle it.
You can switch options or pause deliveries whenever you want, and right now the price starts at $6.99 per serving, which I think is pretty reasonable for a date night. And you know what's even more reasonable? The 8 free meals that HelloFresh is giving to fans of the channel who visit HelloFresh.com and enter Practical80.
They look good.
That's $80 off your first month of HelloFresh. Just click the link.
Okay. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about Texas electricity. So Texas electricity is supplied by 5 main sources of energy, basically to power the turbines that generate it. So this is the ERCOT total generation by source: 42% natural gas, 24% wind, 13% coal, 12% solar, 9% nuclear, and then other here. So this percentage increase in solar energy is amazing. What's happened? It's increased 5 times since 2019. In 2018, it was 50% natural gas, 23% coal, 16% wind, and less than 1% solar. And interestingly enough, yes, question?
I was noticing that is like, holy moly, solar is increasing. And I don't know if any of you guys have a spare $100,000, but if you want to invest in something, Valverde County, Southwest Texas, we'll get into that.
Yeah. So it's about to get more interesting in Texas. So the demand is going to be skyrocketing. The prices will rise dramatically. There will be politicians and people will be pointing fingers. The public will be angry, and there will be good jobs for young people. So this is the demand we're talking about. So this is gigawatt hours, and historical annual energy in the state of Texas. This is from ERCOT. So you can see it's been growing very nicely, from about 279,000 to 461,000, but that's over a quarter of a century. But it's now expected to be rising at a much more rapid rate from 2025, less than 500,000 gigawatt hours to over 1 million in a very short period of time. Okay, that is stunning. And this is why it's expected to happen. Yes, John.
I just say they don't believe their forecasts. That's kind of the number of units that have been requested to join the system and the projected demand, but they cut it in half themselves. It's because they don't even believe that. So,
Well, even if it's
still going to be a rapid increase, no question about it.
Yeah. So this is what I found, but these things, any prediction about the future is subject to change without notice, right? And this is the reason that it is expected, because of these AI is exploding, and that uses a lot of electricity, and then also Bitcoin mining, which may go up or down. And this is the way that ERCOT sees it. So here we are, we were in 2025. This is kind of the base with no photovoltaics. Photovoltaics are down here. Don't worry about that. But what I want to show you is the increase in electricity demand that's projected from data centers, which is basically AI. You know, it just doubles and then doubles again, and then just keeps going up. That's the projection. And then Bitcoin mining, that's this green area in here. There's also some other things in there, industrial and expected industrial uses, hydrogen. This is to make hydrogen, and then oil and gas activities. All right, so this is what they're saying the average consumer can expect. You know, this is the average for electricity, residential, you know, at 10, 12, 11 or 12 cents per kilowatt hour, right? Just bouncing around there up and down. And then it started going up in 2020, and that's about where it is today, about 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And it's expected to continue rising over the time. So let's watch a video, short one.
Well, this afternoon, state officials told lawmakers power demand in Texas is growing even faster than expected.
ERCOT, the state's power grid operator, is predicting that statewide electricity demand will nearly double over the next 6 years. KVU's Adam Bennett was watching the testimony in the Texas State Senate today. And Adam, the demand prediction is due in large part, in fact, to the number of people and new industries moving to Texas.
That's right, Brian. One state official says that more than half of this new demand comes from Bitcoin mining and data centers, including those run by artificial intelligence. She says the rest comes from hydrogen production facilities, along with expansion and electrification of existing industries, which includes oil and gas. Those are the really big takeaways here today at the state capitol during a committee hearing, an interim hearing held by a Texas Senate committee. Lori Kobos with the Public Utility Commission of Texas said that ERCOT expects power demand to increase to 150 gigawatts by 2030. For comparison, today, it's around 85 gigawatts. ERCOT Senior VP testified that to keep up, the state needs to improve generation and improve its transmission. Senators from both parties brainstormed solutions.
It's huge policy implications, and every assumption that we've made over the past 4 years is now called into question once again. All of them.
AI's just come on the scene, but who knows what's next, even after that will consume even more. Can we just say no? You can't come?
Now, lawmakers also talked about generating more power. In fact, recently, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said that 81 companies have applied for low-interest loans just passed by the state recently to build new dispatchable power plants. One example would be natural gas plants. He says those could add 41 gigawatts to the grid. Now, Lieutenant Governor Patrick also responded to what we heard today here this afternoon. He said in a post on social media that the state should take a closer look at Bitcoin mining and these data centers. Lawmakers won't be able to pass any new bills until the next legislative session starts. That'll happen in January. Reporting live at the state capitol, Adam Bennett, KV News.
Just to remind you, we have a 1,600 square feet. This is sort of our typical use, you know, what was that, 600-700 kilowatt hours a month, you know, averaging 20-ish kilowatt hours. And back then we were paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So, you know, if they double the rates, it's gonna go up from, you know, $60 to $120 a month or something like that. All right, something for UTD to consider. The fiscal year 23 electrical utility consumption, including University Village, was 127 million kilowatt hours. UTD paid approximately 6 cents kilowatt hour. They got a deal. That's about $7 million a year. So this bill will be a lot higher in 2030. UTD could save a lot if it invested in solar photovoltaic panels and installed these on rooftops and used the energy. But, you know, who knows? All right. Now let's get into the historical development of the U.S. Electric power system. National Academy of Engineering named electrification as the greatest achievement of the 20th century, but the electric grid began in the 1900s. first hydroelectric plant was in 1868 in England, and demand for electricity exploded after Thomas Edison invented the light bulb in 1879. So Edison developed the first U.S. power plant to supply DC power to Manhattan. This required thick cables and could only transmit electricity about a mile. That was the problem with DC power. So the power loss in transmission lines is equal to I squared times R, where I is current and R is resistance. So very low current is needed to transmit electricity over long distances. ERCOT has a grid of 54,000 miles of transmission lines, and this is why DC current is not optimal for transmission lines. So Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse recognized that by using alternating current instead of direct current, the transmission lines could be set at high voltage, and a transformer could be used to lower current in transmission lines by increasing voltages, because power is equal to voltage times current, right? You can have low current. You can have, at a given power, you could have low current by having high voltage, and remember, because the power loss in transmission lines is the square of the current. If you have lower current, you're going to lose less in transmission lines. All they needed was for somebody to develop the first reliable AC voltage transformer, and that allowed for high voltage to be used for transmission and low voltage to be used for use in the homes. And that's what's happened, basically since then, 150 years ago.
Hi there, I'm William Mack, coming from our Cake Lab in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Did you know that you use two forms of electricity every day? Alternating current, or AC, is what comes to your home from your power company. Direct current, or DC, is what your phone or TV remote uses. And anytime you see a power brick or wall charger, you actually have both, because those convert AC to DC. But what's the difference? And why do we have AC and DC? I'm glad you asked. It's not because engineers make things complicated, there are actually really good reasons. Let's start with DC power, because it's pretty straightforward. With DC power, the power supply provides a constant voltage. For example, USB outputs a steady 5 volts. The current only flows in one direction, from negative to positive, even though the amount of current can change depending on how quickly we want the USB device to charge. Now let's talk about AC power. Remember that the A in AC stands for alternating. That's because the flow of current switches direction, or more specifically, alternates current. This is the type of electricity that flows into your home. In the US, the voltage cycles between plus and minus 120 volts at 60 Hertz, or every 1/60th of a second. And because current is proportional to voltage, the current also alternates between positive and negative. You can also see this by looking at how current flows. With DC, current flows from the positive side of the supply to the negative side. With AC, the current flows back and forth. So we covered how AC and DC work, but there's still the question of why we have both. If you want all the details, look up the War of the Currents. At the simplest level, we use AC power because it can be easily stepped up or down using simple transformers. By stepping voltage up into the hundreds of thousands of volts, we can transmit the power at a lower current, and this reduces the amount of power loss and transmission. The voltage is then stepped back down into a more usable range of hundreds of volts that can be used in our homes. Meanwhile, DC is used in a majority of modern electronic devices. That's why most devices have a power adapter like this one. It takes the AC power in your home and converts it to DC power that your device needs. These devices might use or generate AC signals, but they operate from a DC supply. One reason is that transistors, the building blocks of integrated circuits, require a DC voltage. It's also worth noting that batteries output DC power, which is convenient for all of the portable electronics you use. If you want to learn more, visit our newly redesigned Engineering Center website and search the keyword Circuit Basics. You can also join our conversations by following us on our social media platforms. Coming to you from our Cake Lab in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, I'm William Mack, and remember to stay curious.
All right. Let's here we go. The first AC power station was a hydroelectric plant at Ames in southwest Colorado, built by Westinghouse Electric, became operational 1891, supplied power to a 2.6-mile transmission line to power stamp mills. So stamp mills basically crush the ore, and that's what it was for. So we can date AC power in the United States to that time. Now, one of the biggest things that happened was the building of the first hydroelectric power plant in 1895 at Niagara Falls, and they started the electrification of the world. So this was there's Niagara Falls. So they took a sort of the water around, and then these were the places that they generated the power from the falling water. But this is the old 1895. So this is a typical electrical transmission system. You know, here's the generating station, the generator step-up transformer, the transmission lines, the substation step-down transformer. You see them at substations all around the town. Distribution lines, you know, into neighborhoods. So these are secondary customers, homes. You know, we want 120 volt and 240 volt. You know, primary customers, factories, they want higher voltage. And sub-transmission customer, I don't know what that is. But anyway, there's 3 wires in our homes. One's at 120 plus 120 volt, one's at neutral, and one's at minus 120 volt. And the home 120 volt, which we use for most things, is between neutral and plus 120. And if we want 240 volt, we take it out between the other 2 wires. Remember that higher temperatures increase resistance in summertime, and that high air conditioning demand in the summer really increases current on high voltage transmission lines. And what happens is as resistance increases because of outside temperature and increased demand, the transmission lines will heat up and they'll expand and they will sag, and this can cause problems. So in 2018, there were some very devastating fires in California, which were caused by sagging transmission lines on hot days. So there was one in October of 2018, which burned 10,000 acres, destroyed 264 structures, and caused 4 deaths. And there's another one, the Camp Fire, burned 150,000 acres and killed 63. And PGE reached an $11 billion settlement over that. And as a result, they filed for bankruptcy in 2019. So this is not a trivial matter. All right, so there's different types of alternating current. Just AC in most homes looks like this. Oscillating voltage that produces sine wave. Square waves are often used in digital and switching electronics to test operations, and triangular waves are sometimes used for other things. But generally, we're using this kind of AC. Now, your book talks a bit about resistive and reactive elements in power. It's a bit confusing, but the real power is here on this triangle. So the reactive power and the apparent power, combine to make the real power. So you want the minimum amount of reactive power, right? So you really want as much of the apparent power as possible. And then your book goes into that. Utility customers only pay for real power, and that utilities obviously want to keep that power factor close to 1. All right, so new transmission lines are needed to take electricity generated by wind turbines and solar and connect this to the grid. This is an issue in Texas because most of the, power plants that have been used, anything, nuclear, natural gas, coal, whatever, they've been built near population centers where the electricity is being used. but the renewable energy is mostly being generated in farther west. So we can't really expand that that source unless we build more power lines. And you can see here, here's the cost. And this is a while back. Right? This is, 12 years ago. So these prices have gone up. But it's on the order of $1 million a mile to build a transmission line with a single circuit. And then in addition, if you put them underground, which everybody wants, these are 3 to 10 times more expensive. This is the Texas electricity power transmission lines. So you can see the density around population centers. There's the nice thing about West Texas is there's a lot of distribution centers because of the oil fields out there, but there's not nearly enough to bring electricity generated in the wind corridors over here and the solar region over here, And then we're getting right at the edge of the grid. That's why the Western Interconnect grid sort of stops even east of El Paso. So El Paso is not on the ERCOT. All right. So there's an increasing interest in using high voltage DC for very long range transmission. This is interesting. There's two reasons the book gives is they don't suffer from electromagnetic interference and they require fewer conductors so the lines can be spaced more closely. Needs less wire, weaker towers, and your book talks about that a bit. All right, so we've talked about in the videos, we noticed that you have to have the power in sync, in phase, within the grid. And this is one of the reasons we have several grids. So we've talked about the ERCOT interconnect and then the Western interconnection, which is a much larger area. And then this area, the Eastern interconnection, which involves quite a few other grids, but these are all in phase. So people say, well, why don't we just connect ERCOT, the Texas grid, to these other grids so that if we get into problems like we did in 2021, we can get that electricity. But the problem is that would require integrating the phase of the electricity, the AC electricity in all three of them. And so in order to share electricity between grids, between the interconnects, you have to convert the AC into DC and then send it over a DC transmission line to another interconnect to be converted into AC. So that's why it's not as easy as it might sound. So then the book starts talking about the U.S. electrical power markets. These are complex, and they involve both private and public ownerships. All of them are called load-serving entities. We are loads, right? We use electricity. So there's three types. There's for-profit investor-owned utilities, IOUs, interesting acronyms. Then there's the nonprofit A, which is a public-owned municipal utilities owned by a city, which are called munis, and then nonprofit B, which are publicly owned rural co-ops. All of them are regulated by federal and state rules and agencies. ERCOT is not a load-serving entity. Instead, ERCOT schedules power on an electrical grid that connects more than 54,000 miles and 1,250 generation units. So here's the way it works. So we've got the market. There's the load-serving entity. It's selling you electricity. And then, whereas if you're a major industry, you buy directly from the market. You don't have a service industry involved. Those companies are usually using more than a megawatt. So most U.S. electricity is purchased through a load-serving entity. So there's two cases. One is the customer pays a vertically integrated utility that is responsible for generation, transmission, and distribution. A good example of that would be Pacific Gas and Electricity in California. Or a customer pays both the company that generates the electricity and the utility that provides transmission and distribution system, which is our case. You only pay one electricity bill, but that money is split between the company that generates the electricity and the utility that's responsible for the transmission and distribution system. All right, let's talk a little bit about electricity markets. There's several unusual things about it. One of them is that electricity cannot be stored cheaply on large scale yet, but utility scale battery storage is growing fast, and we're going to be talking about that. Second interesting thing is electricity production has to change continuously to meet demand, at least until we have much more battery storage. Once electricity enters the grid, its source cannot be identified. So if somebody says you're buying all renewable energy electricity, that's not true. What's coming out of your plug is whatever is on the grid, and that's a mix of sources, 1,250 different ways, different generating plants. And the electricity cannot be directed except that it flows from higher to lower voltage via the path of least resistance. As we can see here with lightning, that's what lightning is. It's electricity flowing from higher to lower voltage. So there's two types of wholesale power markets. There are traditional regulated markets, and there are regional markets or regional transmission organizations, or RTOs. So the traditional regulated market is the utility owns the power plant, sells electricity to customers. The prices are set through regulatory control. And these are common in the southwestern United States, southeastern United States, and the Pacific Northwest. Includes all three types of load-serving entities, investor-owned, munis, and rural co-ops. And it includes the large federal systems like the Tennessee Valley Authority. And then there are the regional markets or regional transmission organizations, the RTOs. These are the power pools involving multiple utilities. And 2/3 of the US is served by RTOs. These are deregulated with prices set competitively, and they're relatively new. They came into being at the beginning of the 21st century. So ERCOT. Is ERCOT a regional transmission organization? And the answer is mostly. It performs most of the functions of an RTO, but is not subject to federal jurisdiction because the ERCOT grid is nearly separate from the rest of the country, and power sales in the ERCOT are therefore not interstate commerce, which is Congress, the federal government regulates interstate commerce. So another question is, what's the difference between an ISO and an RTO? An ISO is an independent system operator, and a regional transmission organization is an RTO. They're both entities that oversee the operation of electrical grids, but there's some distinctions. ISOs are non-profit organizations. They do not own the transmission assets, but are responsible for grid reliability and efficient operation. RTOs, on the other hand, are also nonprofit organizations that manage the transmission of electricity. They typically cover larger areas than ISOs and often have additional responsibilities like regional planning for transmission expansion. In some cases, an RTO might be like an ISO that operates on a regional scale with broader authority. And I know this is confusing, but it's still useful to be exposed to it. All right, here we've got the ISOs and RTOs. So there's the California ISO, there's the ERCOT, which is mostly an RTO, these others. Actually, there are four different types of markets involved in this. There's energy, which we all know because we pay our electricity bill. But there's also capacity market, there's ancillary services market, and there's transmission market. So here, let's talk about the energy market. So this sets the price of electricity on $1 per kilowatt hour basis. We know it's several cents per kilowatt hour, and this varies by year, right? Here's US electricity costs. Here's Texas electricity costs. And then natural gas. That's not really pertinent to electricity here. And it is interesting that the Texas average electricity cost is lower than the national average. And this is the wholesale market electricity price, not what you pay unless you signed up for that option. You know, this is dollars per million watt hour, not kilowatt hour. But you can see that, you know, electricity on the wholesale market is quite cheap in the early morning and very expensive, you know, in the afternoon. I'm not sure what day of the year this is, but it doesn't look like summer because it falls off, you know, in the evening, whereas in summer it would stay high till probably 10 o'clock. All right, now the capacity market is different than the energy market. It is the continuous electrical power in megawatts that load-serving entities can transmit to customers. And there's 4 types of capacity resources. There's electrical generation from a load-serving entity or purchased on the spot market. There are demand resources, including interruptible loads. So that's, residents never sign up for interruptible loads, but businesses do. Energy efficiency measures and transmission upgrades. So 4 of the US RTOs operate capacity markets. Others have other mechanisms for increasing capacity. Texas ERCOT does not have a capacity market. Instead, it addresses resource adequacy through its energy market. And in the energy market, our ERCOT sets the maximum price of power equal to an estimate of the value of lost load. So here you can see the next one, which is the ancillary services market, which is ancillary services ensure that electricity is reliably provided for the load. And there's 4 types. There's frequency regulation. There's operating reserve. This would be down here. There's voluntary control. And then there's black start services, which is basically starting up from nothing. So the frequency regulation is, as we said, it's very, very important to make sure that the frequency of the grid stays at the value for which everything is got, basically 60 megahertz. In the United States, we're at 60 hertz. I'm sorry, and in Europe, they're a little bit lower. So there's a little bit of a problem between using the appliances on European power. So what happens is when the demand is less than the supply, the frequency increases. It'll go from 60 hertz to 61 hertz or 62 hertz. When the demand is greater than supply, the frequency decreases. So it'll go to 59 hertz or 58 hertz. And when it gets very far out of the nominal 60 hertz, it can cause serious problems. So one way to deal with frequency control is to increase supply or decrease demand. And in 2021, the way that ERCOT had to deal with it was to decrease demand by basically, shutting down electricity to large parts of the state. Then watch a video.
In the power grid, electricity is transmitted from the power plant to the end user. The transmitted electricity is oscillating an alternating current, which means the voltage is cycling from positive to negative. In the US, the optimum number of cycles is 60 per second, also called a frequency of 60 Hz. The frequency is an indicator of power quality. Appliances may not operate efficiently or even safely if used on anything other than the intended frequency. To keep the frequency within tight tolerance bounds is not easy. If the energy demand is high, the frequency decreases to a value below 60 Hz, which puts stress on the grid. On the other hand, when too much energy is fed into the power grid, the frequency increases to a value bigger than 60 Hz, which again puts stress on the grid. To keep the grid stable, and implementation of frequency regulation is necessary. Energy storage is an easy way for frequency regulation. At high frequency, which means a surplus of power, energy can be stored and batteries are handled like fictional customers. At low frequency, energy and high demand times, energy can be released to serve the customers. Batteries are flexible, scalable, easy to install, and to manage. They can help to keep the frequency of the power grid stable and safe.
All right. Now, another market is the operating reserve, which is the accessibility of the grid to generate electricity. And we need that in case one or more generators that's on the grid is taken out. So the New York ISO requires that there be an operating reserve on their grid at all times capable of providing 150% of the largest generator on the grid. So that might be more than, that almost certainly is more than one power plant. But they've got to be just sitting there ready to provide power if one of their generators goes off or two of them go off. So there's two types of reserves. There's spinning and non-spinning. So spinning reserves can ramp up in 10 to 30 minutes. Non-spinning can also ramp up in a similar amount of time, basically turning the on switch. Then there's voltage control. The voltage needs to vary less than plus or minus 6%. So these reactive power needs to be controlled, and this is handled by online generators, capacitor banks, and devices that control reactive power. And then there's the financial transmission rights market. So if a consumer has to pay a higher price for electricity because of a transmission line is at its limit, the additional cost must be paid to holders of financial transmission rights. So they're not made to the transmission owners. They're basically insurance contracts.
Electricity is a relatively new type of tradable commodity. Several characteristics differentiate it from other commodities such as crude oil or natural gas. First, it is completely fungible, meaning 1 megawatt-hour of electricity produced from either coal or natural gas contains exactly the same amount of energy. Second, it must be produced and used simultaneously. Industrial battery storage is still prohibitively expensive. Therefore, additional systems need to be in place to meet peak levels of consumption. Third, the supply must meet demand exactly in the power grid. Ancillary services and demand response programs ensure that increases in demand are handled in real time. This means uneconomic generation resources are not dispatched when demand is low. They are only put into service during periods of peak demand. Due to these unique characteristics of electricity, independent system operators, ISO, and regional transmission organizations, RTO, are responsible for keeping the power grid balanced between generation and load. ISOs and RTOs forecast and schedule generation to assure that sufficient generation and backup power is in place to meet unexpected demand or generation loss. ISOs and RTOs must be non-commercial organizations, neutral and independent from commercial players. Currently, there are 9 ISO and RTOs in North America. Each one is responsible for the reliability, operations, resource planning, and expansion in the deregulated electricity market. Each ISO and RTO typically operates and manages 4 markets: energy, capacity, financial transmission rights, and ancillary services. Let's first look at how ISOs and RTOs manage the energy market, which includes the generation and consumption of electricity. They manage the energy market via 2 sub-markets. The first is through a day-ahead market, and the second is through the real-time market. In the day-ahead market, electricity generators and load-serving entities submit their bids to ISO RTOs to receive and offer electricity to the power grid based on varying costs for each hour or next operating day. In the real-time market, ISOs and RTOs manage the changes in production and consumption throughout the day. This can range from 5 minutes to half-an-hour increments. ISOs and RTOs optimize the generation dispatch schedule, where they consider cost, security, and transmission constraints. Market participants will commit to the schedule with a locational marginal price, or LMP, set at each location, based on published prices from ISO RTO. In the real-time market, operators send dispatch instructions to each generator based on actual system operating conditions in a real-time basis. Generation and load are priced at each node on the bus. For longer-term grid resource stability, ISOs and RTOs operate a capacity market that auctions the commitment of providing electricity generation capacity to ensure generation exceeds load in the long term. This market incentivizes long-term capital investment in generation resources, and revenues are paid to the capacity providers regardless of whether energy is produced or not. CME Group offers a variety of futures and options contracts for electricity day-ahead, real-time, and capacity markets. This provides market participants a variety of regional locations to hedge and manage risk exposure.
Then your book gets into grid operations, and they go through all of these these things we've been talking about. I think we'll stop there. We're basically only got a couple minutes left. I was hoping to get through this lecture today, which I obviously did not, but so then your book goes into grid operations. So, it's not, you just can't add a new power plant. You've got to consider the total capital and operating costs of plants. And these can be the options, how to, whether to use coal or solar or natural gas or all these other things. These options can be compared in terms of the levelized cost of electricity. We've seen LCOE for energy. Okay. So here is an example of average values for calculating LCOEs in the book. So there's one ultra supercritical coal, which we haven't talked about. We will. Then combined cycle gas, which we have talked a little bit about, and then regular gas turbines. So there's the capital costs, the heating rate, the BTUs per kilowatt hour, the fuel costs, the variable operating and maintenance, and then the fixed operating and maintenance. And then the book works an example, when the company saying, let's build a new power plant, what kind do they build? There's quite a few options, right? So let's talk about these combined cycle gas plants. These are, we've seen that the levelized costs of energy are quite different between two types of gas plants. So the one that's cheaper is this kind, the combined cycle generation process. And this is fairly complicated. This is where the electricity goes out, but here's the natural gas and the air for the gas turbine, and then it recovers the heat, and then it goes into a second turbine. That's why it's combined cycle, and this generates more electricity. And then there's a cooling tower and all that. So I think we got a video, so you don't have to try and memorize that, but here it is. We've talked about capacity factors and the fact that to be economic, you have to make an evaluation of how much your plant is going to be online, making money. Because when it's not online, it's not making money unless you've somehow signed up for a capacity provider, for times of peaking. So here are the average capacity factors of U.S. electricity generating plants in 2015. And you can see that nuclear power plants are pretty much on all the time. They're only down less than 8% of the time. Whereas coal plants are, at around 50%. The gas turbines, which is different than the gas combined cycle, these are the more expensive ones. These are the more effective and the cheaper ones in terms of operating, how much electricity they get. The big difference, regular gas turbines are only be used very small amount of the time. Geothermal's always on. Biomass combustion, we're not going to talk about that. Large hydropower, that depends on how much water's behind the dam. Land-based wind and solar photovoltaics, right? This has got to do with efficient, basically, what percentage of the potential to make electricity that these things are used, 20, 30%. So when you look at the amount of electricity that a plant could generate, you really also have to look at the capacity factor. So anyway, there's a big difference between things like nuclear, which is basically being used all the time, and renewables, which are being used a quarter to a third of the time in terms of the amount of electricity they're generating. Any questions about that? Kind of interesting. All right, so here we look at a plot of U.S. electrical load throughout the year. So January through December, electrical demand in gigawatts, 0 to 800. So in January comes up, that's winter heating, right? And then in the spring, we don't need so much energy because it's pretty comfortable. And then as summer comes up, and certainly in Texas, we need more and more because of air conditioning, more in the south than in the north. And then we go back into fall, which is pleasant again. So this is the electricity demand. And then in addition, the utilities want to have an extra 15% on whatever this is, whatever this peak is expected to be, for the situations. So this is a normalized load duration curve. So this is for your conventional electricity generating plants. Let's just imagine, this is a while back. So coal provides all of the base load, which is basically 51%. This is, that's 1 to 8760 hours at load. That's how many hours in not a week. I guess that's a month. No, yeah, I'm not sure what 8760 is. It's not 24 times 7, like times 365. Yeah, maybe. Okay, so most of the time the base load can handle it. And every once in a while, the load comes up, say in the summertime or the wintertime, and you have to add some gas combined cycle. And then only rarely do you have to bring these inefficient gas combustion turbines in. So that's why, this is needed as well. And these are going to be decided based on the levelized cost energy comparisons. So gas combined cycle. Now coal used to be cheaper. It's, now it's more expensive. So this, right now, all of this coal is being replaced by combined cycle natural gas. And that's what they're building in Texas now. Any questions about this diagram? All right, so this is an example of how utility might use different generators through the week, right? So what is this? This one is hydropower, right? It's running all the time, maybe. Nuclear, it's running all the time. Here they're putting coal in here. This is back, 10 years old, so it's not true anymore. Newer gas, which is our combined cycle gas. Older gas, that's our regular gas turbine. And that's interesting. I would not put CTs up here. They wouldn't be peakers. I would use your older gas. This is where I would be using my combined cycle for an awful lot of the load. A little confusing, but I think you get it. You have to, utilities has to figure out which mix they want to do, and ERCOT is dispatching on this basis. All right, now the book talks about the integrating variable renewable energy on the grid. And this is a very nice plot from ERCOT. And what it's showing is, so this was September 2024, which very sunny, not too windy, but not bad. A lot of electricity demand. And so here we're going through a day. So that's 24 hours. And what you can see is that at 8 in the morning, which would be 7 in the morning out in West Texas, the solar photovoltaic production goes way up, right? And it'll stay there pretty much until late afternoon, fall off to 0. Now, wind is also kicking in, and it's stronger in the early mornings in general, and then sort of falls off during the day. But this is their projection of how it's going to go. So this is 25,000 megawatts. Remember, our daily demand in Texas in September total is about 85 or 90. So this is providing a hell of a lot of Texas's electricity. But there has to be a planning, because if you're going to add 25 thousand megawatts to the grid, and the demand isn't going to change that much, right? It's going to be low here, but it's going to come up in the day and stay up in the afternoon. You're going to have the duck curve problem, which we talked about previously. We'll talk about again. So, the utilities give this capacity credit. It's assigned by the utilities, and that accounts for the probability that an electrical generation technology will be available during peak load hours. So it's a ratio of megawatts from a displaced conventional plant to the rated output of the wind or solar. So that's basically the firm capacity that the renewable energy source can provide, and that's based on long-term probabilities. So one way to get more constant wind energy is to have more wind turbines spread out over more land area. So here we have 15 turbines. So over about, 8 hours. And you can see, with fewer turbines, there's going to be more spikiness. But, 200 or 215 turbines, I don't know why they had to show both, because they're basically the same. You get a much better smoothing out. So adding more wind turbines can help deal with some of these problems. And Texas now has, tens of thousands of wind turbines. Now, another way to get more constant solar voltaic is to have more solar panels spread out over more land area, but you're still going to have this curve that goes from zero when the sun comes up to a maximum at noon in the afternoon to zero, when the sun goes down. So this is, you can see that you can smooth this out by having basically an entire state, integrating the solar that it generates. Whereas one plant, two plants, they're much spikier because clouds come over, right? All right, so and the power system dispatch becomes more complex as renewables increase. And we've seen, this is a diagram from your book, but this is talking about the duck curve again. And you can see this is a typical summer day. So this is the sort of the energy mix that's going to be used with no solar photovoltaics. So, geothermal, wind, nuclear, coal, combined cycle gas, hydro. Looks like a California curve. And then as you start bringing in photovoltaics, to match this demand, things have to go away. So let's look and see as the yellow gets bigger, what's going away. It looks like what's going away is mostly, here, this reddish pink stuff, which I can't really see here. Oh, combined cycle, So that the dispatchers have to be aware of that mix. So the point is that more photovoltaics can reduce the carbon footprint, but not peak demand. The peak demand still has to deal with that. And so the question is, how much solar photovoltaics can you add before there starts to be a stress on the grid? And that's something the Texas legislature has been addressing. Okay, so here we've got, the same sort of a thing. No photovoltaics, and then, as you really penetrate to 10% solar photovoltaics, it really impacts the other things. So these operators are not going to be happy because their budgets are based on what percentage of the time that their generators are being used. They get money for that. And if they're forced to shut it down, so that the solar can be integrated into the grid, they're going to be negatively impacted. This is going to really disrupt the economics of the power generation. So battery storage would help solve this problem. If we could take some of this, or as or a lot of it, and put it in batteries and then discharge that at peak times after the sun goes down, the problem would be fixed. And that's part of what's happening with the battery market. Okay, now we talked about the duck curve and solar photovoltaics. We're just showing it again. What we've talked about here, this is the duck curve. It's being shown here in a different way. And this is the easy way to remember it, right? All right. So your book says, whenever any new generator, renewable or conventional, is brought onto the grid, it can negatively impact the operation of existing generators. And that's the role of ERCOT, is to sort that out. So let's watch this video.
I think solar power is one of the biggest changes that the world will see in my lifetime. It's a truly revolutionary technology. I've had solar panels on the roof of my house for 7 years, and just recently I've upgraded it and fitted a Tesla Powerwall. So even if the battery's completely flat, by the time I'm up and around with the dogs, it's got probably 3, 4, 5%. And that's enough, interestingly, to boil a kettle and put on the toaster. On a sunny day, mid-morning, it's at 50%. I know that I'm capturing most of that electricity for later use, so it's a very, very different mindset. The Tesla app, I'm embarrassed to admit, I reckon 20, 25 times a day I'll check it. I get a little bit obsessive with it, I admit. So basically what a Powerwall lets you do is use the power from the sun at night. When the family's here and we're cooking, the laundry's doing, the washing machine's on, the tumble dryer, the dishwasher, the kettle, I know we're not taking that power from the grid, which we used to be when we only had solar panels and didn't store the energy. Now we're taking all that power from the Powerwall. The glory is its guilt-free use. The vast majority of electricity that we use in this house is coming from the sun, and that is a great feeling.
Example of a residential scale electrical system. Now, one of the interesting things about Texas is we have the best in terms of the amount of renewable energy from solar and wind in the country at the utility scale, but at the residential scale we do not. We're far, far behind. So individual houses in the summertime could be generating a very large percentage of their own electricity, and with something like a Powerwall could be even using it in the evening. Now this is, for this to happen, the legislature needs to do some things, which they haven't done. But this is one of the obvious solutions to the looming energy crisis, electricity crisis in Texas. And I hope that the legislature will see the wisdom of encouraging residential scale solar photovoltaics and battery storage to complement the utility, the growth in the utility generation. Now, this is an interesting diagram. This isn't, it's 5 years old, but it's still kind of interesting. So this is an Irving-based company called Vistra, a very successful electricity generating company, and they took an old coal-fired power plant. This is near Monterey, California, and they turned it into a big battery storage facility. So what we're seeing now is, when I started teaching this course, that was 2021 was the first time, and this is where we are in 2025. The battery storage is increasing rapidly. Now at Moss Landing, this is just one example of one of these facilities. So 4,500 racks of batteries stretching for 3 football fields can generate 1,200 megawatts of power, enough to run 225,000 homes during peak periods for a short time, not all night. This is another kind of battery storage. This is called pump storage. So the price of electricity goes down at night because everybody's asleep and doesn't need it. So if you take water from a lower reservoir and pump it up the mountainside, when electricity is cheap, then you can generate electricity and sell it when electricity is expensive. So that can complement some of these things. So this is an example in California. Clint, you'll like your lake here. This is the Owens River. And this is, up at 11,000, 12,000 feet. This is down at a couple thousand. And that's the Helms Pump storage area. There it is in California. We'll watch a video.
Every flip of the switch takes power. Each charging device adds to the demand. During summer, air conditioners and ceiling fans further stress our local grid. How do we meet this demand? The answer sits right here in Fresno County, between Courtright and Wishon reservoirs. The Helms Hydro Plant is located 1,000 feet underground and is considered one of the most exceptional hydroelectric facilities ever built, capable of generating 1,200 megawatts of electricity. That's enough to power 900,000 homes. The plant utilizes nearly 16,000 feet of tunnels moving water from the higher Courtright Reservoir to the lower Wishon Reservoir through 3 turbine generators. At night, when energy demand is low, the generators run in reverse, moving the water back to Courtright Reservoir, where it is ready for use the next day. Without this plant, our grid could not meet summer's demands. The Helms Hydro Plant is one of Fresno County's many marvels.
All right. Now, another way to deal with this is with what we call concentrating solar power, or CSP. Now, this is different than solar photovoltaics, and we'll talk about both of them in greater detail later in the course. But this is the challenge for CSP is, right now, the levelized cost of energy in cents per kilowatt hour is 21 cents, which is much higher than it should have been, and so you have to bring this down to compete with photovoltaics, which are much cheaper than this. So 2018, it was 10 cents a kilowatt hour. The goal is to get to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. You may remember that UTD is buying a lot of electricity, and a couple of years ago, they were buying at about 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So companies have to be able to generate it at 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour in order to be competitive. So this acronym TES means thermal energy storage. So this is a standard part of most concentrated solar plants. The usual medium are molten salt that can be heated to temperatures up to 600 degrees, depending on the type of salt. So you can store that once it's heated and then use that to generate electricity via thermal steam driving a turbine after the sun sets. And at present, these CSP TES plants can't run all night at full power, and some of them will have a natural gas turbine to fill in when the sun is down and the TES runs down. And of course, the problem is that CSP has a higher levelized cost of energy than photovoltaics, but they can provide electricity at night. So let's watch. Yes, Clint.
What is the reflecting material?
Oh, I don't know. Some kind of corrosion resistant material. We'll talk about this in more detail later. But I just wanted to, in this electrical, systems lecture, touch on the growing role of batteries, which we need to talk about more in detail later. So, combining solar photovoltaics with concentrated solar power gives more flexibility. So it makes the ducts back higher. The point is that concentrated solar power electricity is dispatchable like natural gas electricity, but photovoltaics are not. So that is an important consideration. So the problem is the levelized cost of electricity for solar photovoltaics is 20% that of CSP. This is from Lazard, their most recent. So here's where we are. So obviously any company in its right mind is going to be opting for these kinds of things. Now, this is called conventional. This is called renewable. Now, geothermal is dispatchable, and in a lot of ways, the big concern is the mix of dispatchable versus intermittent electricity sources, right? Solar photovoltaics are, utility scale, are not dispatchable, right? You only got it when the sun shines, unless they're coupled to batteries. Geothermal is dispatchable. Wind is not. Gas peaking is. Nuclear is. Coal is. Gas combined cycle is. So here we've got, here's gas combined cycle. So it's a little more expensive than wind and utility scale photovoltaics, either kind. But these have the disadvantage of not being dispatchable and causing the problems with the duct curve that we talked about. So this is, right now where the state of Texas is emphasizing investment. They would like to put money into nuclear, but right now the costs of nuclear are so high that, and we'll talk more about that later. So really the evolving mix in Texas is going to be these things and this and this. And you can see why coal is slowly going away. It's not because the liberals are in charge of the electricity industry. It's because the companies have, for some reason, want to make money. Okay. Now, this is a field that is a little confusing, but the grid integration costs determine the additional costs of integrating wind energy into the grid, and spinning reserves are an especially important curve. So here we've got, an Arizona Public Service study of the costs in dollars per megawatt hours of integrating wind power as a function of grid penetration and forecasting ability. This is 1% wind energy, 4%, 7%, 10% wind energy penetration, and these are, as these renewables get involved more and more in the grid, the costs go up to figure out how to and involve them, integrate them into it. It's a little confusing, but I think it makes sense. Okay, and here you can see the mismatch that your book shows between demand and wind energy and solar energy over the course of a year. I'm not sure where this is. Doesn't look like Texas, but you can see there's this mismatch is the problem. That's why renewables without batteries, really massive battery capability, is not possible at this stage. And this is, your book's got a table summarizing the potential challenges and solutions for transitioning to a grid with a large penetration of variable renewable sources. Here are the challenges, and here are the solutions. So worth taking a look at. Then your book goes into demand response and transactional controls. So one way to deal with more renewables is to be able to reduce peak demand. So there are a number of useful demand response approaches, and this maybe relates more to efficiency, what we talked about previously with energy efficiency and decreasing demand. So one of the demand response approaches is our price responses, which relates to time of use pricing and real-time pricing. If you use electricity when the demand is low, you get a cheaper rate than if you use it when it's high. Peak shaving, which focuses on reducing the peak demand. The reliability response, which concerns with having a way to rapidly respond to changing demand to accompany power outages, and the regulation response, which where demand is adjusted to follow minute-to-minute changes in supply. So there's growing movement to develop what they call the smart grid to inform when there is a problem with the transmission lines. So, and the book talks about the fact that U.S. buildings consume 75% of electricity, so measures that spread out the peak load over the day and the week allow more renewable energy supply. And there's increasing use of these transactional controls for demand, more smart appliances, and what they call IoT, the Internet of Things. So here's a model of how a home energy management system could respond to a signal received at 1 p.m. indicating a load shedding event, a demand reduction event it's going to happen between 5 and 9 that night. So, the computer could pre-cool the building, charge the building battery, at 5 p.m. begin using the battery and curtail overall electricity use. And then you can save, that much electricity during the event. And this is something computers can handle. So, we'll be seeing more of this in the future.